In a recent post about preparing for fall cover crops, I showed an area that was overgrown with grass, hairy vetch, and old cover, and I showed how I'm going to flail mow it in order to open the space up, to add biomass to the soil, and ultimately prepare it for a fall cover crop. But there's one question that keeps coming up. I'm Justin Hitt from Prosperity Homestead. The big question is the tall grass a breeding ground for ticks and rats and other types of pests? Now, understand in an urban space that tall grass tends to have creatures in it. And a lot of folks are concerned about creatures such as ticks, mosquitoes, rats, mice, but they don't understand the concept of how these creatures breed. So, we're going to talk specifically about ticks. Ticks breed on the back of larger animals. So, in the case of the garden area that I was flail mowing, there are no ticks in there, or very few ticks, because there are no large animals to bring mature male or mature female ticks into the area in order to breed, where they would lay their eggs in the surface waste. So the tick itself lays its waste in the surface of the soil, where there's a lot of uh, rotting materials and leaves and stuff like that. In a case of a garden space with overgrown grass, such as a tall cover crop, there aren't that many breeding locations for the tick itself. And if there are no large animals moving in and out of the space, the probability of mature ticks being there that are of breeding age is very, very low. However, it is entirely possible for there to be ticks to breed in such an area, but not likely. Now, there are some preventative measures you can take. You can introduce chickens or guinea fowl who will predate on the ticks themselves, or you can also make the habitat welcoming to your larger birds or your different types of small birds that eat ticks and so and so. But I can understand the fear. People look at a overgrown space, they relate their experiences in an urban setting or their experiences over time. Maybe they've walked through a field and got some ticks, but they don't understand the breeding cycles. Now, in a garden space, especially one with a fence around it, we're actually excluding the large animals. Now, if we introduced goats or we had other animals come through the space and actually, utilize their labor to knock down large plants and eat large plants, then again, there could be ticks in that area. The breeding of the ticks themselves is dependent on an environment suitable for breeding. And so, in the case where we're chopping and dropping materials, there are rotten materials on the surface, but there are also centipedes and small insects that would also predate on the ticks. So by removing the large animals, there aren't likely to be as many ticks. Now, if we look at a proxy, which would be a large paddock that has animals, large animals in it, and we ask the question, are there ticks, or is the pasture a breeding ground for ticks? The answer could be yes or no as well. Just because there's large animals in the area doesn't mean there might be ticks, because again, there could be uh, different types of wild birds that predate on the ticks. It could be guinea fowl or chickens as well. But it also could be a situation where the animals are maintaining the grass at a lower level, and those ticks are not making it up onto the animals themselves because they either aren't there, or they are, uh, again, being predated or not having the opportunity to get onto the animal. Imagine how small a tick is compared to the size of a growing space. Now, again, people also say mosquitoes. They're worried about mosquitoes if they see standing water. Well, larger bodies of standing water tend not to have a lot of mosquito larvae in them because of dragonflies and other creatures that predate on the larva itself. You'll get water bugs and things like that. But small bodies of water will, especially small bodies of water as small as what will fit in a leaf. See, what folks don't understand is that a tick, the way it breeds, it doesn't matter if it's 4 inches of grass or 4 feet of grass. In the case of mosquitoes, it doesn't matter if it is a 5 gallon bucket of water or it is a teacup of water. Mosquitoes tend to want those settled beds of water in order to breed, that are less likely to have predators in them. But they aren't going to breed in larger ponds. They aren't going to breed. I've heard this a lot. I have kept small fish ponds, and folks have said you can't have these in the neighborhood because they're going to attract mosquitoes. And I said, well, there's fish in here and I don't feed them all the time. And so if it does attract mosquitoes, these fish will eat them. So really what we want to do is we want to understand the breeding cycles of the pests that we're concerned about so that we can disrupt the breeding cycle by either the introduction of animals, the exclusion of animals, or how the space is managed. So finger ponds, for example, maybe 5 to 6 feet wide, 2 to 3 feet deep, are not going to have as many mosquitoes in them as you would in a flower pot that's full of water that hasn't been tipped out. So we want to break the breeding cycle because if there are no larvae, if there are no baby ticks, there will be no adult ticks. And the adult ticks of breeding age or mosquitoes of breeding age is really the bigger concern. So yes, we do want to manage our spaces so that we have less pests, but we also want to manage our spaces so we have more predators. We want predation on those less desirable creatures. I don't see any value in having a tick or a mosquito, other than being food for our more desirable creatures, such as our dragonflies, small birds, um, water bugs, fish, for example. So I would move you towards a system where you would chop and drop more frequently. So the video that we had, it's titled "Preparing for Fall Cover Crops with Chop and Drop." The grass is too tall. You do not want your grass and your cover crops to get to a point of going to seed unless it is a desirable seed. So if you have a good cover crop of hairy vetch, pigeon pea, you've got different kinds of annual grasses, for example, you may want those to go to seed because those are desirable plants that can choke out the other plants that we don't want. But again, if you've got thistles and uh, nightshade family plants, or you've got binding weeds, then you would want to chop and drop them more frequently. The more frequent chop and drop will return the material to the soil as biomass, and that's really what we're doing here. Um, and it would reduce the seed bank in the soil itself, making it less probable for the plant to come back. So now we have a parallel between pests and plants, showing that we can break the breeding cycle or the reproductive cycle in either one in order to control the kind of what's in the field. So now you're looking at your garden as, are we growing what we desire, which would be fruits, vegetables, biomass that is suitable for quick composting? Or are we creating things that we don't want, ticks, mosquitoes, uh, weeds that are, maybe they're indicators of soil health, but they are not contributing to the calorie count of our garden space? And then how do we address those? Well, we address them by promoting the things that we desire, the small birds, uh, the vegetables, and we demote those things by breaking their reproductive cycles to reduce the things that we less desire. Now, this is a very important concept to understand because you can use things like animal rotation in order to. So, for example, you've got a herd of goats and you're going to bring them through a field and you notice they're picking up a lot of ticks. So, you may want to go and slash that field, exclude the goats from the field. You're going to move them to another field. You're going to give them the tick treatment. You're going to do what you need to do to get that resolved. And then you may introduce chickens or guinea fowl in order to put pressure on those ticks in that field set while it's resting from the goats and the goats are off working someplace else. Now, again, there are other approaches. You could introduce the chickens while the goats are out there. You could have a combination where your rotation is faster than the ticks can breed. You might use mob grazing. You might use a combination of animals in mob grazing. You might be in a situation where um, you basically are disrupting the cycle of the ticks by how you treat the treatment you provide on the animals. But again, the ticks are going to breed if the habitat is conducive to breeding. So you have to make sure you're monitoring that. Another case is where a animal trough is small enough in order to have mosquito larvae in it. So you might want to add a treatment such as BTI, which is a bacteria that kills the larva. Now, introducing it to the animal's drinking water is probably better to maintain running water. So animals, for example, you don't want to ingest different things like the mosquito larvae, the uh, waterborne stuff. So you want to basically pour their water out, make sure they've got fresh water. You might want to use a float system rather than having a big basin of water sitting out there for the animals. That way they can have fresher water. They can have water that's moving. Uh, Mosquitoes will not lay their or hatch their eggs in moving water. So again, we want to understand how these creatures work. We don't want to just freak out and be like, "Oh my gosh, that's a breeding ground for ticks. Oh my gosh, there's swarms of mosquitoes," because in most cases, a well-managed site will have such a low population of these things that it's not going to be a bother to your animals or to the people. And so again, you want to understand the breeding cycles. Now we could go into those breeding cycles in detail. There are hundreds of pests that you could encounter in your garden. So if you want to talk about that, I have a program on beneficial insects. And what I tend to do is promote the beneficial insects so that they will attack and destroy those less beneficial insects. But these creatures in the wild have value. So I don't want to say you want to put up with ticks because I recently got seed ticks a couple weeks ago from a hike in the woods, and it was not a pleasant experience. Um, but you do want to make sure you understand the breeding cycles because a leaf in the woods that holds enough water, just half a cup of water or a quarter cup of water can breed thousands of mosquitoes. And if you're worried about tipping over every little leaf in your yard, you will be in a situation where you're focusing on the wrong thing. You're focusing on the pest, the problem, rather than the solution. So, really, what you want to do in that situation is make sure you have some kind of predator in that environment that will predate those mosquitoes because in the woods, you know, that's where the ticks and mosquitoes are going to breed. Um, we can open up trails, we can manage our animals properly, we can run chickens through the trails, we can overall have an increase of other wild birds, pigeons, and quail, and different things like that. In a garden space, we have the exclusion of the fence around our garden space that prevents the large animals from getting in there who could carry in breeding size ticks or mature ticks. And then we also, from a mosquito perspective, we understand that they can breed in a drop of water that's connected to a plant. So we want to not allow them to have ready spaces to breed, such as water containers uh, for animal drinking, or basins that are full of water, or ponds that don't have fish in them, because you can put small fish in, they'll eat the mosquito larvae. So again, if you have any questions about this kind of thing, I don't want you to fear the things that we're doing. When we allow cover crop to grow hip high or even taller, we have a purpose for doing that. But if tall grass bred mosquitoes and ticks, then the prairies would be full of those things. You can walk through an area without getting ticks when you understand this season, for example, when you understand the breeding cycles, and ultimately you can actually reduce that population by introducing predation, by introducing creatures that feed on these ticks. Now, ultimately, you'll never get to zero ticks, you'll never get to zero mosquitoes, but you can make it reasonable and you can make it not a pest. I'm Justin Hitt with Prosperity Homestead. If you have questions about what we've covered today or anything else we cover, visit us at www.prosperityhomestead.org. Go to the contact page, ask your questions. You'll be added to a mailing list where we'll show you these videos that I'm talking about that are on our YouTube channel. And we'll also introduce you to other skills and tips to make your small farm or homestead more enjoyable, more productive, and even grow the value of your land. Until next time, this is the Prosperity Homestead Podcast.